Hello everyone, so we'll be talking about output gap and Okun's law. More specifically, potential GDP, zero, positive, negative output gaps, cyclical unemployment, and Okun's law. So we'll start. Potential GDP. It is the level of real GDP attained when firms and businesses are producing at capacity and labor is fully employed. In other words, it's the maximum that we want our potential GDP to be. As well, it attempts to express an economy's maximum level of output and a sustainable rate. Okay, now we have that. We'll talk about output gap. It is believed by many economists that it is the most accurate measure on how far away the economy is from potential GDP. In other words, it represents the percentage deviation, which is how far away the economy is from potential GDP. So, percentage deviation of actual GDP from potential GDP. Another definition, it measures how fully the economy is employing its resources. So, again, potential GDP, we want it to have like the maximum resources. So, these resources, such as labor, natural, physical, and human capital, as we have here. So now we'll talk about the formula. Output gap, which is this one. It is for the numerator, it's actual real GDP minus potential GDP. Then the difference of this one is divided by potential GDP. Now this is just a short example. Real GDP is 500 billion and potential GDP is 550 billion of a certain country. So we put these numbers into this formula, which we get this, and then it's approximately equal to negative 0.091 or negative 9.1%, which is a recession. Then we'll talk about zero output gap and positive output gap and negative output gap. For zero output gap, the economy is producing at its potential. So it's when actual growth is equal to sustainable growth. Then for positive output gap, the economy is producing above its potential. So as we can see here, actual growth is above sustainable growth. And then negative output gap, it's the economy is producing below its potential, as we can see here. Okay, now what do these truly mean, or another definition? We have zero output gap. The economy is producing at its long run capacity, producing the maximum sustainable level of goods and services, which makes sense because the economy is producing at its capacity or at its potential. Positive output gap, the economy is operating at a level greater than it can sustain in the long run, which we can see here because actual growth is more than sustainable growth. Okay, so in the long run, it is greater than it can sustain. Then for negative output gap, the economy is operating below capacity, which we can see here. It's less than sustainable growth right over here. Okay, now we have that. Let's talk about cyclical unemployment. Natural unemployment rate, it is the normal unemployment rate that occurs when the economy is producing at potential GDP. So very different from actual unemployment rate. Now we have this cyclical unemployment rate. That's the difference between the actual unemployment rate and the natural unemployment rate. Okay. So during recessions, just to further define it, during recessions, this rate increases, which makes sense because it's during a recession. But as the economy enters an expansion, this rate, the cyclical unemployment rate, may continue to rise for a period of time, because it doesn't just automatically go down, but later on it starts falling. Okay, so now we have Okun's law. It describes the statistical relationship between the output gap and cyclical unemployment, which we can see here, output gap and unemployment. So for a formula, this is cyclical unemployment is equal to the negative of H, which is Okun's law coefficient, and multiplied by the output gap, which is the formula in the bracket, as you can see here. Now, Okun's law coefficient, it shows the impact on the cyclical unemployment rate from a 1% change in the output gap. It is less than 1 because it is costly to hire and fire workers, which makes sense. And then, unless otherwise stated, we assume that Okun's law coefficient is 0.5. So now let's talk about Okun's law through an example, afterwards, but we'll first show that when the output gap is 0, the natural and cyclical unemployment is 0, which makes sense because it is at its potential. When output is above potential, the actual unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate because it is above sustainable growth, which is a lot of actual growth. And then, when the output is below potential, the actual unemployment rate exceeds the natural rate, which makes sense again because it is a negative output gap. Okay, now we'll do the example. Suppose there exists a country called Econ. In 2021, the actual unemployment rate in Econ was 6.5%. If the natural unemployment rate is assumed to be 5%, what is the output gap? Assume that the Okun's law coefficient is 0.5. So this is the formula again. We isolate output gap because that's what we're looking for, which results into this negative cyclical unemployment rate divided by the coefficient. So we have the negative sign here, 6.5% minus 5% divided by 0.5, which is equal to negative 3%.